and welcome to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair and in this episode I spoke to renowned academic Sir Dieter Helm about his new book, Legacy: How to Build the Sustainable Economy. Sir Dieter is Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford, and his book, which I should underline is open access and therefore free for anyone to read, sets out a radical new economic vision which would tackle our current climate and biodiversity crisis.
Since it's true that what is not sustainable and what we're doing is not sustainable will not be sustained, it will come to a crunch. There is no question about it. You can't pretend that we're not going to have 3 degrees warming if you at the same time accept that we're not on course to reduce emissions and fossil fuels on the path we're on. Imagine that we're going to somehow escape the consequence of this or escape the consequence of wiping out so much biodiversity. It's going to happen.
I began by asking Sir Dieter what had spurred him to write his book.
The reason I wrote this book is that it's the culmination of work that I've been doing for a couple of decades. I've watched as the destruction of nature has carried on at pace, particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s where things accelerated, but we're now in a situation where, frankly, all our main rainforests globally are under threat. There's bits of the Amazon that are net emitters of carbon. So I've watched this, and I've watched the climate change story alongside. And what's really struck me is how little progress has been made. You know, we have all this enthusiasm, which is great, about renewables and a whole series of interventions and policies, and in many countries around the world. But what we observe is that the concentration of carbon, and that's the only thing that matters in the atmosphere, it's the stock of carbon up there, has been going up for 2 parts per million every single year since 1990, indeed since 1980. So we're now at 420 parts per million. That's a big step up. There is not a blip for the financial crisis in the first decade of this century, and there actually isn't much of a blip even for the coronavirus lockdowns. And what this tells you is what we're doing is unsustainable, but more importantly, the policies that we're following, 27 COPs, 28 COPs and so on, are not having an impact. So what I tried to do in this book, and it's really the consequence of thinking through lots of individual policies and a deep sadness in a way that we haven't yet made progress, is to sit down and write out what the sustainable economy would actually look like, what it would be like if we lived within our environmental means and gave to the next generation a decent inheritance so they could choose how to live their lives. And that includes a decent biodiversity, a decent set of natural capitals, and a decent climate within which to function. So that's been my motivation for doing this. And it's a stand back. Not what are we doing so much as, since it's unsustainable, what would a sustainable world actually look like? And that's what I describe.
I'd be very interested to hear what your reflections are on current economic and political thinking on climate and biodiversity.
Listen to what economists say, and you follow the Stern report and all these things. You get an economist view about how to tackle this, and it's being applied. I stand back from this and say, is there something fundamentally wrong with how economists like myself have conceptualized this problem and therefore thought about the appropriate policy responses? And the book has a kind of subsurface theme, which is conventional economics really is found deeply wanting when we come to the climate change, the biodiversity, the natural capital, and in 2 or 3 particular ways. First of all, almost all economics deriving from marginal utility, etc., is utilitarian. It's about making people equally happy over time, looking after the happiness of future generations. It makes no distinction between different types of goods or services. It doesn't matter what they are as long as they make you happy. I'm not interested in making people happy. I hope they are, but I'm interested in something rather different, which is I'm interested in citizens, not consumers. Although citizens are consumers, I'm interested in making sure that future citizens, and indeed current citizens, have the wherewithal to choose how to live their lives. And that requires assets. It requires a decent education, a decent health provision. It requires an electricity system that functions. It requires a water and sewage system. It requires broadband now. It requires transport. And most of all, it requires a functioning natural world, including its biodiversity and its climate. So that's the first thing. My focus is not trying to make people happy and be utilitarian. I don't think that's either the purpose of life. That's an ethical point, which you can disagree about, but I don't think it's a good way of thinking about it. The second point is economists go round and use what's called expected utility and probabilities to describe the future. I haven't a clue what the world's going to look like in 250. This is not the way to do it, to try and find some computer model to predict out what it's going to be looking like. You know, I started out with an Olympus portable typewriter, Tipex and carbon paper. There was no mobile phone. There was no internet. There was no laptop computer. There was no word processing, and there was no chat GPT. And my world is completely different from the world I envisaged in the 1980s when I was doing my doctoral thesis. And if I roll forward, the speed of technical change is just enormous now. You know, it's just AI and digital and robotics. It's genetics and the ability to understand the very building blocks of life, plus the physics, etc. So I deal with the question not of trying to predict the future, but saying, what are the core assets that any human civilization is going to need? So this links to my point about citizens. What people need are these functioning assets in perpetuity, these infrastructures for life. You know, conventional economics makes no distinction between different things like infrastructure as opposed to chocolate factories. They're just factories, right? No. Some things are essential for you and me to participate in society and for the economy to work. And those are very key bits to the next generation. And the third bit, which flows from that, is almost all economics, GDP, etc., is about flows. It's about eco-services when it comes to the environment. No, what we should focus on is assets, these core assets in perpetuity. And, you know, when William the Conqueror rocked up in the UK to conquer the place, the first thing he did, or almost the first thing he did after killing off lots of the inhabitants, was to do the Doomsday Book. He went round and asked, what have you got? What are the farms? What's the land? What are the buildings, etc.? And, you know, if you look at an economy, if you're not an economist, if I say, how's Italy going? You'll tell me, you've got these fantastic buildings. Have you been to Florence? But, you know, the river's in a terrible state, the Po, and actually there are droughts and there's a huge amount of pollution around the outside. And quite a lot of the human capital is not what you want it to be, etc. Right? And if you go to Germany now, they'll tell you the trains don't work. That's what they're focused on. So I want to know about assets, and these assets in perpetuity, which we must bequeath to the next generation, not eco-services. I don't want to know what the value of a primrose is or the value of a scenic view, not discrete projects either, systems, asset systems. So there's three core bits: citizens, not consumers, the fact that we've got radical uncertainty into the future, not expected utility models, and stocks, assets, not just flows.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the next generation part of the book? Actually, there's a heavy focus in your book throughout on looking at the next generation and how we should consider the next generation. Can you say something more about that?
So this is an ethical point. If you don't like my ethics, you can go and choose some other model. The book is all structured around the idea that we have a duty to the next generation to ensure that they can live their lives as best as ours. And that's where the assets fit in and the transfer through. A number of people have raised the question of, well, why don't you care about the generation after that one? And indeed, why do you care more about that generation or as much about that generation as you do current people living in circumstance, okay? So I have some pragmatic reasons for this and some principled ones. So the pragmatic one is, if we did even care about the next generation, that would be a massive step forward from where we are at the moment, because we clearly don't. You know, you can say you do, you can tell opinion polls, we really care about climate change and all this kind of stuff, and we care about the future. Really? What's the evidence? How are you living your life? Are you doing anything to change your ways, to be more sustainable in what you do? The evidence is everyone says they care about these things, but they don't do it. Okay, so it would be a massive step forward. It would be a revolution in the way of thinking about the world in practice. The second thing is we're connected. So our concerns are most for people around us, our families. They next come for our community around us. They next come for our nation, whether you like that or not. And only mankind in general is further out. It's like dropping a stone in a pond and watching the ripples. And our concern diminishes the further people are away from us now and further away in terms of geography, culture, and time. So the reason we care about the next generation, or we can, is because we have children. We know them. We see them. I see my students all the time. I see my grandchildren. So it's absolutely natural to human nature to build on that as a surer foundation. Now, the question then comes, what about, the generation after next? So my take on this is, and this will, I'm sure, upset a lot of people. If you want to take me to 10,000 years' time, I don't much care. I do maybe a bit. It's quite nice to know there'll be humans around in 10,000 years' time. But, they're not really very important to me. And much more seriously, I'm not sure they'll be human in the way we are. It's going to be in this century that you will be able to download your brain. And when you think about where AI and the new technologies are going, and you think where genetics are going, it is not clear that we have this infinite future in front of us where there'll be people exactly like us and no evolution will take place. If I look backwards, do I really care about those forms of the Homo genus, which were very closely related to us and we came from? Do I care about Homo erectus? Not a bit. I'm interested in the architecture. So I think that's honesty about human nature. It's a pragmatism about where we could get the focus to go. And it's a more general philosophical point about what these people will be. And you know what? If each generation looked after the next, the future beyond the next generation gets looked after too. So I think the next generation should take my principles and apply them to the one after that.
There is a part of the book I remember where you talk about the current economy at least being focused towards the older generations as well.
The reality is that we have amongst the democracies a substantive shift towards the average voter being in their 50s. I'm not sure what it is in the US, where the population dynamics are somewhat different, but in many European countries, the emergence of longer life expectancy and the rapid decline of the birth rate produces this result that we basically rule ourselves in the interests of the old. And you might think the old would have more concern for future generations. Absolutely not true. They vote for higher pensions all the time. I don't worry. I look at my students and think the electorate is voting for you to be part of a smaller workforce that's going to have a big burden to pay tax to look after our pensions amongst the older people. And this isn't the right way round. I'm very in favour of making sure that we have a society that properly respects the dignity of older people. But the older people have an obligation to the young, and they have to realise they depend upon them. Right? So when the young people flee Russia or they flee Iran, this isn't some temporary problem. This is fundamental to the interests of the older people in those countries, because once the young and best go, you're stuffed in terms of economic output to look after them. So that's why I think that we have to think seriously. And at the end of the book, I have my most speculative chapter, which is on the Constitution, which is starting to think about how the interest of the next generation can be taken into account. I looked at the American Constitution, and people listening may have different views about where the American society is going, etc. But the Constitution is still a remarkable document. It doesn't prescribe detailed outcomes. It protects general things like you must take free speech into account. You must take the rights of all individuals into account. Well, all I'm saying is that there should be a check on what we do, which requires that the interests of the next generation is properly taken into account in making the day-to-day decisions of government. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems. And of course, constitutions can always be amended. But I'm grasping for ways, pragmatic ways, to get over the selfishness of the current, and in particular in Europe, ageing populations, and the potential what democratic theorists thought of as the tyranny of the majority over the minority. And the next generation is, in political terms, the minority, and we should protect their interests. And I think constitutional ways are part and parcel of doing that.
I wondered if, before we went into the practicalities of, how you could actually get to this, achieve this vision, we could go into just maybe one or two of the examples in the book, which might help explain some of the elements in this kind of system that you set out. I mean, one of them, which I think you're a pretty expert in, is water. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about that, water infrastructure.
So water is going up the agenda everywhere globally. I mean, in a planet that's mostly comprised of water, scarcity of fresh water, key parts of the world economy and where the populations are, which are beginning to become not just stress points, but binding constraints. So it's not just the UK that's going through, a crisis in respect to water. It's general. There are some broader approaches which we will have to use. And this is particularly for cities and particularly in the wider global context. And that's clearly desalination. We're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to do that with renewable energy. But the crises in Europe are not really about there not being enough rain. There's a lot of rain. Some of the climate models suggest, and you would expect this with more energy in the atmosphere, there's going to be more of it. It's not the supply that's the problem. It's the demand, and it's the infrastructure to provide it. And it's the infrastructure for the sewage too. In my world of assets, and a water and sewage system is something the next generation should inherit, these are assets in perpetuity. Right? That means that you shouldn't depreciate, which is what most accounting does, right? You shouldn't get your money back for the investment. You should make these investments, and these investments should be maintained forever. And that's called capital maintenance. If there are potholes in the road, if the bridges aren't working, it's your duty out of current income to fix them. You fix the tiles on the roof, you fix the potholes in the road, you fix the bridges, you fix the water pipes, you fix the sewage works, and you fix the natural environment and the climate. These are costs to us, which we should pay. They're not investments, they are maintenance. And if you look around the world, but particularly if you look in the UK as the example, what we have not done is maintain these assets. And therefore you have absurd positions where, for example, in the southeast of the UK, for those familiar with it, there's a water company that failed to provide water to local populations when there was plenty of water in the reservoirs and the schools closed. This is absurd. It's not just good environmental practice to look after these things. It's not just good for the next generation. It's absolutely vital for people now. And it's good, efficient economics to do that. So that's why I focus on these things. And many of my examples are very nitty-gritty because I'm not just interested in the general philosophy of this, the general framework. That's important to me. But I want to know that it's operational, that actually it changes what we do now, and often in ways that are sensible to do, even if you don't care about the climate and even if you don't care about the biodiversity destruction. These things are just practical, good sense, system economics, and you won't find these in economic textbooks because there's nothing about accounting, there's nothing about asset systems. Indeed, there's very little about assets. Each project on its own merit, cost-benefit analysis, willingness to pay, etc. No, as an approach to this broad, overarching frame. There are particular areas where this sort of analysis and traditional economics is useful, but it's a special case, not the general. And I'm trying to provide a general framework with practical policies within it.
I have to say I enjoyed reading those critiques in the sense that, just somebody who has read a few economic textbooks and thought, this doesn't seem realistic.
It's not just about realism. I started out putting together the collected papers of one of the greatest 20th century economists, John Hicks. I'm deeply immersed in both macro and microeconomics, but I also had the good fortune to have a brilliant supervisor of my doctorate, which is Amartya Sen. And he always questioned these frameworks, although he did tell me very early on, he said, You can go on criticising this, but make sure you know where the spots are on the leopard before you start attacking the leopard. And he made me, and I've always been grateful, to really immerse myself in conventional, what we call neoclassical economics. I know what I'm attacking, and I know what I'm challenging, and I know its strengths as well as its weaknesses. But right now, the weaknesses come right up against these generational issues, which have never concerned economists in the past. Keynes wasn't interested in the environment or the future. He thought that would look after itself. He was concerned with mass unemployment in the 1930s and depression. It's as if we've never moved on from thinking that's the primary issue. Every period of history has its own challenges, and the textbooks in economics are, in my view, seriously wanting in providing an answer to these problems as opposed to some of the 20th century problems.
And this probably brings us on towards the end of your book. You do say that the kind of question that haunts your writing is around how realistic it is that the model you set out could actually be adopted. Could you give some thoughts on what the first steps might be in kind of getting towards this vision? I wondered how you thought that current economists and within governments, given that you've worked with them a lot, and politicians might react to your writing on this and how they might respond and how maybe you can actually help them to respond.
If you care about things like natural capital and the climate, care deeply about them, this is beyond the analytics, right? That's what you think matters. And we all choose in our life to work out what matters to us, okay? So this really matters to me. And I live in this world which is kind of schizophrenic. If you ask me seriously what's going to happen, I can depress you very quickly. I can tell you how the parts per million are going to go up. I can tell you how we're not going to hit the net zero targets. I can tell you how the demand for oil is going to stay above 100 million barrels a day for a very long time to come, etc. So that's one side. The other side is it's no good being pessimistic. You have to come up with practical solutions because you have to assume, and I do assume, that it doesn't have to be like this. You know, we can actually sort this out. And it's not rocket science to do it. And the book is saying, this is where you want to get to. But when I think about how to get there, I come up with, in the book, what I take to be very straightforward ways of harnessing lots of things which we already know about. You have to do the accounting properly. You have to have a balance sheet. You have to have your assets. You have to have government accounts which don't disguise debt as pretending that it's investment when it's capital maintenance. Polluters have to pay. It's efficient to include the costs of doing so. You have to provide the public goods like research and development. You have to make sure your systems are maintained through time. These are all practical things to do, and I have a whole chapter on how to actually regulate these systems. I think this is here to do, and I take into account also the distributional questions and basic income and things of that ilk. It's not as if I'm inventing anything new. I'm simply corralling together within my framework how to take this forward. Now, the politics of this is what everybody then says, but we're never going to do this. What they mean by the politics is usually they mean they have some politician in mind. The politicians are creatures of you and me. What they really mean is you and me are not prepared to make the changes, or rather vote for the changes that would be necessary to make this happen. We are selfish. It's part of our deep human nature. There's evolutionary reasons for it. And so the question is, when would a politician stand up and say what I say in the book, recommend the policies I suggest, and hope in hell that they're going to get elected? And my answer to that question is in several parts. Since it's true that what is not sustainable and what we're doing is not sustainable will not be sustained, it will come to a crunch. There is no question about it. You can't pretend that we're not going to have 3 degrees warming if you at the same time accept that we're not on course to reduce emissions and fossil fuels on the path we're on. Imagine that we're going to somehow escape the consequence of this, or escape the consequence of wiping out so much biodiversity. It's going to happen. It's whether it's ex ante or ex post. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is some things in the package are very sensible to do anyway, even if you didn't care about the environment. Right? It is pretty sensible to fix the potholes in the road. It's pretty sensible to make sure your energy system actually functions. And it's pretty sensible to make sure you're pretty much immune from Russia or someone else cutting off the supplies. And it's pretty sensible to make sure you have minerals. So a lot of it is good economics anyway. And I always think you should do the no regret stuff first, okay? But the final point's this. Having studied particularly energy policy since the early 1980s and written about the history of this repeatedly, I've come to a conclusion. You don't get significant shifts of policy without crises. And they happen after crises, not before. So if you think of the Great Reconstruction, when all the infrastructures had to be rebuilt, in a circumstance in which the population were on rationing, food rationing, and debt to GDP was well over 200% in the UK, for example, it's in 1945. What happened was there was a big switch to investment from consumption. The state was, of course, actively involved in this. We rebuilt the housing stock. We built all those power stations to fuel the greatest expansion of economic output in the United Kingdom ever, much greater than the Industrial Revolution. And what's more, the end result was not one of, poverty, death in the streets, and all the terrible things that the people who don't want to do anything about the environment claim these policies would produce. Quite the contrary. So we have done it before. The question is, how can we edge towards doing it before these consequences actually start to hit you and me? And that requires a lot of dimensions. I think ultimately it's us human beings that are cause of all of this. And it's us human beings that have to adjust to this. Some things require carbon taxes. Some things require public expenditure. Some things require regulation. And indeed, some things require turning the tiller quite radically against some of our current practices. But it's that mix. It's trying to be brutally realistic about where we're heading. It's trying to be very realistic and pragmatic about how we can solve this problem. And then that is ultimately what all an academic can do, which is try to shape that debate. In my lifetime and in what I've done, I've had one stunning success. I chaired the Natural Capital Committee. We proposed a 25-year plan to ensure the natural environment was in good state for the next generation as this. We happened, and this is an accident, but you must exploit these whenever they happen, have a Secretary of State who was actually interested in doing it and cared about these things. And the result is that the Environment Improvement Plan, which is the 25-year plan, is enshrined in legislation in the Environment Act in this country, supported by statutory environmental requirements. It's been done. It's in law. For me, I'm very proud of this because I beavered away for 8 years with my committee to get this in place. And we did it. That shows this isn't impossible. Success is out there to have, but not if we go on like this. New ideas, new economic frameworks, new policies, and a new focus, not just on ourselves, and particularly the older generations, but on the next generation. And that's what the book tries to do.
Thanks very much to Professor Sir Dieter Helm for his time. Do remember that his new book, Legacy, is an open access title, and you can find links to read it on our podcast blurb, as well as Sir Dieter's recommended further reading. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for producing the show. And if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to like and follow us on your podcast platform. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. And thanks for listening.